So since it's after lunch, I had originally wanted to have a lot of fun going into the details about how Datadog calculates their net dollar retention ratio using an ARR weighted trailing average of 12 monthly. But we decided since it's after lunch, we better kick it up a little bit. And we're going to kick it up a lot. So when I talked to Matt about what to do for this presentation, rather than do SaaS metrics, one of my favorite topics, we opted for just kind of extracted wisdom, the things I've learned along the way during my own career, during the companies that I've worked with. I've sat on boards, I've run companies, I've been an executive at companies, and even in many cases, just the experiences of my friends. So, and the goal, the orientation was to try and make it proactive advice for how to get the most out of the next 5 years. So I thought it was an interesting topic. Thanks to Matt for suggesting it. And let's just jump right in. The way we're going to approach this is through stories. So I'm going to tell a story, and then every story has one or more morals, and we'll go through the morals of the stories. Before I do that, if you don't know who I am, I'm first and foremost these days a blogger, so KellBlog.com, where I blog about enterprise software, marketing, metrics, strategy, among other topics. My background, I started out as a self-taught programmer back when computer programs looked like that. And the best thing about paper tape was if your program didn't work, you could literally burn it on fire, which was very satisfying, unlike today. But yeah, I actually wrote programs on paper tape. I started my career technical, moved into the business side, and then ran marketing at Business Objects as we grew from 30 million to $1 billion in revenue. I ran MarkLogic, an XML database company we'll talk about, from 0 to 80 million in revenue. I ran Host Analytics from less than 10 million in ARR to more than 50 million in ARR. Sold that in December. And have sat on multiple boards. So kind of fusing all that experience together, we're gonna tell some stories and try and get some advice about how to make the best of the coming 5 years. So I'll tell you a story. I'll start this. One of the best things that ever happened to me was kind of strange. It was driven by a treaty between the US and France called the Totalization Agreement. And the Totalization Agreement said that an American expatriate living in France has to return by 5 years, or else they are subject to French Social Security. So you get to live overseas for 5 years on US Social Security, and if you flip to French Social Security, you end up under French stock option taxation, where the incremental tax was more than 100% of the gain, believe it or not. So it was a very bright line. Like when you hit this 5-year mark, you needed to leave. And the result of this, my 5-year mark was coming up on July 1st, 2000. So I was planning for this, and I started to make my plan. And I said, gosh, I have all this Business Objects stock. We're in the middle of the internet bubble, so it's worth quite a bit of money. I'd been always too busy to sell it. So I'm like, well, I guess I should sell a bunch of it now. And I first figure out the process for how to sell it, and then go through the process of selling it. So consequently, I liquidated a very large amount of my Business Objects stock between January and March 7th of 2001. And guess what happened on March 15th of 2001, right? The internet bubble burst, right? That was the day of the beginning of the bursting of the internet bubble. So there's a lot of lessons from this story. There's a bunch of them in there. The first is that luck happens, both good and bad. And I think as participants in Silicon Valley, we need to embrace that. Good things will happen to us, bad things will happen to us. Same for our friends. The outcomes are not always tightly coupled to the inputs. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. The second moral, and this one's more subtle, is that financial outcomes vary much more widely than operational outcomes. And that's for two reasons. One, market leadership. There has always been in Silicon Valley a big premium for market leadership. Say in the 1990s, the first place company, if you have first, second, and third place, the first place company might be worth 5 times the third place company. I'd say today the first place company is worth 15 times the third place company, right? So you can create a company that's half the size of your competitor, but they're worth 7 times more, right? Because they're getting that much of a market leadership premium. So these outcomes are becoming more unequal due to winner-take-all markets. And the other thing that makes outcomes unequal is just simply timing. I had friends at Business Objects who literally made no money because they were too busy to sell their stock. And that's a mistake, right? We can never be too busy to think about our financial outcomes. So the morals of this story are, one, understand the value of market leadership. You get disproportionate returns as a market leader, which means you should be willing to chase market leadership if you're not there. And second, Never be too busy to think about your outcome. I knew lots of people who were, and it's a huge mistake. So that's the first story. Second story, this is an amazing story. A friend of mine named Steve ran a $150 million company. It was kind of a centaur, like half BI, half search, or a car boat, whatever your favorite metaphor. And it was a good company. It had a good product. It was a visionary idea, but it was kind of stuck at about 150 million in revenues. And they were having trouble growing, and people didn't necessarily understand it because of this man-beast, half horse, half human aspect to it. And if you had told this guy 9 months before this happened, he never would have believed you, right? If you went up to him and said, you know what's going to happen? HP's CEO is going to start to try and have a dalliance with a marketing contractor. That's not going to work out. She's going to complain. He's going to get fired as a result of that. As a result of him getting fired for that, HP is going to appoint a new CEO. That new CEO is going to be, let's just to be fair, a questionable in terms of prior experience for running a company of that scale, questionable choice. That CEO will make one of the most disastrous software acquisitions of all time. They'll spend $11 billion to buy a search company. He will then be fired for that. But a month after he buys that company for $11 billion, Oracle's going to buy you for $1 billion just to hedge it, right? And that's actually what happened. That story went down. That's why I call this slide the butterfly effect, because if you know the movie, right, they go back in time, someone steps on a butterfly, and the world has changed in the present. And this also happens in Silicon Valley. And I think, the moral of this story is, first, hard work and patience can be rewarded in unusual ways. I have lots of friends. Another friend of mine started a company, got an offer, his board wouldn't sell, worked at it for literally 10 more years, sold it for almost nothing to a big company, and then his career rocketed up at the big company, right? You never see, the pattern I see is that people who are determined and work hard and who are good eventually get rewarded, but it's often in unusual ways, right? That story was unusual. This story was unusual. Don't forget the 12 years. That company was 12 years old when it got bought. So there was 12 years of hard work. It wasn't all just luck, but to me, that story, I think of two metaphors on it. One is the butterfly effect, and the other is what I call the whitewater rafting. And I always tell people when they want career advice in Silicon Valley is to understand that you're whitewater rafting, right? And what does that mean? You're in a river, and the river's moving. The river's going to take you somewhere that you can't necessarily control, but you do have a paddle. In fact, you have a fair amount of control over a whitewater raft. You just don't know it because you have to work with the river. So it's not that we're totally out of control. We do have some leverage, but we have to figure out where and how to use it. So we'll come back to this theme in a minute because it's kind of a constant theme in the presentation. So the worst thing that ever happened to me. So a few years later, I had just turned 40. Things are going super well. We had just had our fourth kid, Brian, the one who explained to me what a goat was. I'd never heard the phrase before. And then this came along, right? And this, it actually looks very pretty. Its actual name is diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. So I get diagnosed with this when my kid is 2 weeks old. My fourth kid is 2 weeks old. It was in a pretty terrifying time. And it actually worked out fine. I'm here today. I'm healthy. That's Brian today. I could always remember how long ago it was when I was sick by his size. He's now 6'5". So everything worked out happily, but it actually did change my career in a subtle way. And how so? In 2004, right as this experience ended, I took the CEO job at MarkLogic. And, I knew that MarkLogic was not going to be an easy ride. Gartner had written a note 2 years before I joined called XML database, the market that never was, right? So it's not a good indicator, by the way, that you're in a hot market, right? If Gartner's saying the market doesn't exist. But I had a hunch I knew what to do with the company. And look, from a financial viewpoint, as the CMO of a billion-dollar company at the time, Business Objects, you always have two choices, right? You have what I call the rinse and repeat option, right? For example, I was being recruited by VMware to be a CMO, right? Early. That could have worked out pretty well, right? Or you have the self-actualize option, right? Do you try and push yourself to a new level and say, gosh, I've always wanted to try and be a CEO. I've watched my boss be a CEO. Let's go do this. And I think in Silicon Valley, that is a constant question you're faced with. Do I rinse and repeat, which can be very lucrative, right? Because Silicon Valley, we love to hire people who just did that, right? Oh, I just took a SaaS company from 10 to 100 million, let's do it again, right? Nothing makes VCs and boards happier than rinse and repeat executives. The problem with rinse and repeat is you don't really get to self-actualize. So there's a trade-off, right? Because you're not pushing yourself. And that's kind of the point. They don't want you to push yourself. They want to hire somebody who knows exactly how to do the job. So in this case, my actual plan was to do a rinse and repeat. I was going to go be a CMO one more time, but because I'd gotten sick, and when you're meeting with your doctors, they're talking about your 5-year survival rate, you're thinking, well, maybe I don't have as much time as I think to try this CEO gig. So that was actually what triggered me in the end to become a CEO at that time. My original plan was to wait and do a rinse and repeat first. So I took what was arguably a very tough opportunity, right? At MarkLogic, in my opinion, we did amazing work. There were 16 XML database companies when I joined. All but MarkLogic basically died. So we took a space that everyone else died, and we built an $80 million business on $3 million in burn a year. I was pretty proud of what we did operationally. But the problem is, and operators need to always remember this, there's a difference between building a business and building value. And we built a great business, but to build value, there has to be a liquidity path. Somebody has to either want to buy it or you want to be able to take it public. And MarkLogic was really not particularly teed up well to do either. Worse yet, I was of the opinion that we should sell the company and the board wasn't, so then you get into this kind of sideways board dynamic. So as I always say, you got to be focused on how you're going to create value. Don't be focused just on creating a business. Be focused on how to create value, because if you're not careful, my joke, and the reason there's a latte up there is, hey, I built an $80 million XML database company, and that plus $3.85 will get you a latte, right? so you need to focus on how to build value. So what's the moral of that particular tale? There's 3 or 4 of them. The first, and I think this is pretty obvious now, but that old model of work for 40 unhappy years and then retire, both elements of it are dead, right? People don't want to work for 40 years unhappily, and they don't want to retire either, right? So, and I experienced this personally, because that was a shirt that my father-in-law had. My wife is French, and he had this shirt, and he had actually done the 40 years of work. He was the director of finance in a sugar beet factory in France, retired, and then died 2 years later. Right? It's just fundamentally a flawed model, right? So you shouldn't put off everything you want to do, then retire hoping to do it all, right? So that social contract is dead. I believe that people should assume that the experiment we call life can end at any moment, and therefore make your choices accordingly. And particularly what that means is don't build debit balances. Don't keep saying, oh, I'll spend time with the kids next week, I'll spend time with the family next week, right? That's a bad way of living, because if things end suddenly, you're not going to like it. So that's probably our most philosophical slide. Now, back to the more practical side of things. What's the moral of this story? Picking is huge. One of the earlier speakers talked about picking, and this is a quadrant I made after I left MarkLogic, where I put on the x-axis opportunity quality, and I put on the right axis execution quality. And to me, MarkLogic was squarely positioned in the thankless work quadrant, right? We brought great execution to a fundamentally weak opportunity. And you want to avoid that quadrant, right? You don't get a lot of value in that quadrant. The bottom quadrant, poor execution on a poor opportunity. Happily, I've never been associated with one of those, but I've seen them, and I'll just call that a clown car. You don't want to work at any of those companies. Bottom right, I unfortunately started my career. My first job out of college was at Ingress. I was a tech support guy, and that was a company called Ingress, which was a relational database that lost to Oracle, right? So it was a phenomenal opportunity, but the company didn't know how to execute against it. It thought that technology won, not sales and marketing. And then the upper right quadrant is what I'll just call fun and money, because in those companies, you're typically, you're bringing great execution to a great opportunity, and that is both fun and it's both lucrative. So I think people need to put an enormous amount of time into picking. I've seen many, many good people make bad picks, and the way the river works, the way that Silicon Valley works, is you get judged by your picks. So all of a sudden, you may have been an SVP at Salesforce, and then you go to one bad startup, and you go to another bad startup, and you're looking for a job. Silicon Valley, that Salesforce is gone. That's a distant memory, right? All they say is, oh, you've been repositioned as a failed startup person, right? You need to be very careful in Silicon Valley how you manage these choices, in my mind. So picking is everything. So the third moral of the story, I got another quadrant for you, is that rinse and repeat can be very lucrative. I have lots of friends. My original plan was to rinse and repeat. It got accelerated by my illness, but I have friends similar in mine in age who did 2 or 3 rinse and repeats after that, and you can make a lot of money doing it. You don't need to be a CEO to make a lot of money at a startup. You can be a VP or any CXO, and if it does well, you will do well. And by the way, because you're doing it again, you're going to see higher quality opportunities, right? You're going to really get your pick of the litter. in terms of opportunities. So the bottom left quadrant is you're known as a star to the people who are making the hiring decisions. So it's either you've worked with them at a prior company, or maybe they're VCs who are on your board at company A and you're going to company B. That is the most lucrative quadrant. The bottom right quadrant is really your career path, right? You should want to get promoted at companies you're at. So my advice to young people is get promoted where you're at and then do a lateral. Right? But if you're going up at a company and then do an upward move, it's a warning sign. That's the top right quadrant, right? To which my question is always, wait a minute, you don't know me and I've never done the job before. Were there no qualified applicants willing to take it? Right? That's the jaded way you need to look at that. And you need to look at it that way because it is a big, big warning sign if somebody who's never met you before and never worked with you wants to promote you into a job you've never done. What it usually means is no qualified applicant would take the job. So they're getting desperate, and you look like a good, first order approximation of who could do the job. So fourth moral of that story is know where you're going. So, these circles are out all over the internet. There's different variations of them, but you're just trying to intersect three things, right? What are you good at? What do you enjoy doing? What will make you sufficient money? For example, I started my career in tech support and training, and I was good at it, and I enjoyed it. So it was kind of 2 out of 3. but unfortunately, at the time, it was not going to do really well on the bottom circle, right? And I think it's important to try and really intersect these 3 circles. In my opinion, as we manage our careers, there's a time for making money, and there's a time for self-actualization, and you need to be very mindful about what you pick to do. And remember that self-actualization comes at a cost. Failure is an option. In fact, that's kind of the point, right? If you're not trying something you've never done before, you don't know if you can do it. And it comes at a high opportunity cost because the whole time you're trying that, you could have been ex-VP at some brand name company that's doing really well. So I think these decisions need to be made mindfully and deliberately. Now, another observation. So when I was at Business Objects, I joined at 30 million, like I said, and we grew to $1 billion. And I noticed one very interesting thing, that the CEO had defined his job as largely strategic, right? Product strategy, market positioning, finance, kind of very strategic activities. And there was a COO job that was super operational. It ran the entire go-to-market operation, all the geographies, all the countries. And if you looked at how much those 2 jobs changed between 30 million and $1 billion, in my opinion, the actual work in the CEO job didn't change that much. I'm sure he would, I'm sure he would find things that he would say differed, but just from where I sat, it didn't change anywhere near as much as the COO job, right? That went from running 100 people to running 2,000, 3,000 people, right? So my observation on scaling is, and by the way, because that job changed so much, we went through 4 COOs during that time period. And we had 1 CEO during that whole time period. So the moral here, particularly for startup founders, is create a scalable role and embrace metrics. The first one's probably obvious, the second one less so let's cover them both. But simply put, if you want to be in it for the long haul, that means you should define yourself into a role that doesn't require directly building and scaling a huge organization. Because if you haven't done it before, you don't want to be doing it for the first time at your startup. I remember as I drove here today, I came off 280, there's this big construction project where they're building a building, and all kinds of people doing things. And I looked at it and I go, that is surely a job where you want the project manager to have done that before. Right? If you said, oh, it's my first time building a building, right? No way would you ever hire that for smarts or brains. You hire that for experience. I believe the same thing is true for CFOs and for COOs. Those jobs, yeah, you want everyone to be smart, but you need experience. You want a CFO who's seen everything. You want a COO who has built that kind of organization before. Very, very important. So I think if you want to define yourself into a role where you can keep running your company over the 13 years it takes to get it public these days, then you should define yourself into a scalable role and look to delegate to some CRO, COO, other role where you will hire someone to do it for you and hire someone who's done it before. That's the first thing. The second thing is you have to embrace metrics. I say that not because I'm a SaaS metrics nut, but metrics don't change. Whether you're talking about a $10 million company or a $10 billion company, they have a CAC ratio and they have a net dollar retention rate. And it means the same thing. Right? Metrics are the abstraction through which we view a business, and as you scale the business, when you're little, you can talk to every salesperson, you can talk to every customer. You don't need an abstraction. But when you get to 50 million, 100 million, for me at Business Objects, it was around 300 to 500 million. I remember saying, I can't know everybody. I can't know the customers. Like, if I'm lucky, I can know the top sales reps, right? You get big enough that you need the abstraction of metrics to understand the business. So if you want to be scalable, hire someone to build the big, meaty part of the organization that's hard, who's done it before, and make sure you certainly stay in touch with all those people as best you can, but use metrics as your abstraction for understanding the business. It's really the only way to scale. The second observation on scaling is I always believe that the hardest job in Silicon Valley is first VP of sales at a startup. I don't think there's any harder job. Why? Because no one knows if the product works, no one knows if people want to buy it, no one knows what it should cost, right? There's so much unknown, and you are going to be held accountable for a revenue number, right? Whoa, what a terrible deal if you think about it, right? And if for any reason it doesn't sell, who is blamed? Right? You, right? And whether or not it's your fault, right, you are blamed. So I make somewhat tongue-in-cheek the order of termination in Silicon Valley startups not making their numbers, right? The first person to go is the VP of sales. The second person to go is the CRO. Cynically, I think some people have a CRO just to create that layer, right, an extra insulation layer to buy them another quarter or two of misses. Third person is the CEO, founder, and the person who's never fired is the product founder. True story, a friend of mine's a venture capitalist, and he called me up and said, Dave, we want to incubate you in a company. We think you should start a company doing X. It's our idea. We want someone to go found it, and we think you should be the product CEO, product founder. And I go, why should I be the product founder? I'm more of a sales and marketing guy, but I'm okay on product. And he's like, very simple, product founders last forever, right? If you're taking revenue responsibility, you're only good as your last couple of quarters. I thought it was a very insightful point. So we'll get to the moral in a minute, but understand that when you're scaling, if you're missing your numbers, it doesn't take too many quarters for the board to start looking at this order and go, okay, what do we do? And by the way, it's a little bit to a fault because Silicon Valley boards, they want to blame sales and marketing because it's easier to fix, right? Blaming product, that's a big deal, right? It's harder to fix that. So there's this default tendency when things aren't working to say it's got to be go-to-market. Next slide. So what's the moral? Pretty obvious. Be the other co-founder, right? So my advice is, be smart, humble. Let the other founder say, hey, why don't you take revenue responsibility? Or like, why don't you be CEO? I'll be the CTO. You're both going to have the same equity. The alternative, by the way, there's an alternative to that, which is have strong control provisions in your documents, if you can get them. Have strong advocates on the board, right? There are going to be good days and bad days in any startup. I can tell you, Business Objects, not every quarter was perfect. There were time periods where we were in the Wall Street penalty box for a year. And I believe without strong advocates on the board who believe in the company and its leadership, it can be a big problem. So you want to stay aligned with your board, right? You want to stay in touch with them. And again, back to the being too busy to do your job sort of thing. Just like I said, don't be too busy to think about a financial outcome for yourself. Don't be too busy to talk to the board. A lot of CEOs and executives, when things are going badly, they kind of hunker down and stay away from the board, and that's exactly the wrong thing to do, right? That's the time you should be calling the board and talking about what's going on, because certainly they are, guarantee it. So to summarize this, let's go through. So we told you some stories, and we talked about the lessons learned from them. The first, to remind us, is that luck happens. It's, when I first started working in Silicon Valley and my first friends hit it big, I'm like, is that a good thing or a bad thing, right? Because this guy's hit it big and I haven't hit big yet. And I eventually said, it's probably a good thing, right? Because it means we're playing the right game, right? We're all out in the playing field, and if my friends are hitting it, if I'm doing the same thing they are, eventually it should be my turn. So the patience of knowing that you're on the right playing field kind of reduces any volatility of emotion in thinking about it. So I always say, don't take it personally if things break your way. If things break against you, and don't get too cocky if they break your way, right? Because you're going to do it, the other way to think of this, I think if every startup I go to is pulling on a one-arm bandit, slot machine, right? And you pull it, and you're never sure what's going to come up, and you're going to get a few more pulls in your career, right? And sometimes they're going to come out good, and sometimes they're going to come out bad, and it's not always going to be linked to how operationally well run you were. Let's just be very clear. So, second, think of startups as whitewater rafting. We talked about this. But you're in a river. It's not that you have no control, but you have limited control. And it means two things. One, you should learn a lot about the river. How does Silicon Valley work? For example, the story we talked about where we said Silicon Valley is going to reposition you very quickly in line with your last two companies, right? You should know that as you paddle yourself down the river, right? You should know that if you go to startup A that's backed by world-class investors and great people versus startup B that maybe you like the founder and you like the technology better, but lesser investors, well, that decision is going to define your network for the next 10 years, right? Because if you go to either one, if you go to this company and work with them and it works out well, then all those people are now in your network and those investors are now in your network, right? And in some cases, another business object story, one thing that was not very fortuitous for me was all of our investors were at the end of their career. So they all basically retired. After business objects, almost our entire board retired. And as a business object executive, that wasn't a good thing, right? Because my interest would be they all stayed venture capitalists, back me in my next company, help me find other companies, right? So there's an argument when you pick your investors that you kind of want people roughly in your age cohort, right? So you can ride for the next 20 years with them if it goes well, right? Because it doesn't help you as much if they all retire. So that's what I mean by say understand the river. That's what I mean, right? And we'll talk about the paddle in a minute. But the other thing we talked about already is assume the experiment called your life could end at any moment and choose accordingly. Understand the criticality of picking, right? You're defined by the brands on your resume. Your network, as we talked about a minute ago, is defined by the people who you've worked with. And that network includes the investors and board, not just your operating partners, right? I worked at Salesforce for a year. I didn't put it up there, but I met some of the best people I've ever worked with at Salesforce. I'm very glad I went there because it was fantastic for my network. In the end, I left because I really felt my destiny was to go run startups, not be a GM at a big company. But I was very thankful for the year I spent there and the people I got to know, right? Because that helped my network enormously. So the other thing is picking is basically your paddle, in my mind. And the question is, that's great, Dave. You're telling me to get good at picking, but how? And the answer is, I think if there's one simple rule of advice, which some people won't like, it's follow strong investors. Let them pick for you. Let Sequoia pick for you. If they picked Medallia as a great company 5 years ago, it probably is. It turns out it was, right? They picked ServiceNow 10 years ago, right? So you can let the investors pick for you, or you can get to know investors, because in general, investors think similarly about companies. Not always, not all the time, but get to know some venture capitalists and ask them, right? Ask other people. Let other people help you pick, because my theory is, no matter which of those four quadrants the company you're going to work at is, if you're a great person, you're going to put your heart and soul into it. Whether it's thankless work, whether it's a clown car, whether it's a fun and money, whether it's a bumbled opportunity, your effort is not going to change. Your outcome will change radically, right? But your effort will not change much at all. So if you're going to bring that great energy and that great effort, why don't you bring it to a company in the top right? Right? And how do you find one of those? Follow strong investors, ask experienced people, get mentors, talk to venture capitalists. Next summary point was choose your career goal using the 3 circles, perhaps in phases, by the way. You don't have to go, for me, when I was in tech support, I said, I read the Ingress S1 and I said, I want to be a CMO one day. Why? Because I'm good at technology, but not good enough. And it seems that my unique gift is explaining technology and being articulate about technology. And I don't want to carry a quota, so boom, marketing. I said, that's what I want to go do. And then after I did marketing for 10 years at 2 different companies, I said, I want to try being a CEO, right? You don't have to do everything at once. The next point, I think a lot of founders forget this. If you want to be around in the long run, you need to survive in the short run, right? And there will be bad patches. So design the organization so that you have some insulation. Stay aligned with your board. Finally, don't be too busy doing your job to think about your outcome, to think about communicating with your board in bad times, or bonus, we didn't really talk about it before, but to build a network with your team. One of the smartest people on my team, it's a funny story, a lady who ran marketing for me, you know how boards, every board meeting, like, well, our other companies, they're doing this, or other company is a really successful user conference, so they're doing great digital marketing. And that drives the marketing head crazy, right? So what did she think of doing? She called up all the other CMOs of the portfolios of our board members and created a club. It's a fantastic idea. So when one of the board members said, well, at Company X, they're doing this, she goes, I was talking to Ben about that the other day. And let me tell you, so it was fantastic. So not only did she get a great network of fellow marketing peers, but it actually made her incredibly well prepared for the board meeting because she knew more about what Company X was doing than the board member did. So great networking advice. So don't be too busy to build a network. Finally, this is a teaser for an upcoming blog post, but keep your kitchen clean and your cap table cleaner. We won't go into this one, but if you are a founder and you're raising money, look for an upcoming post on this. So hope you enjoyed the presentation.